during Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky's negotiations today in Washington, let's break down what the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is currently proposing for making peace. What is he trying to insert into that very peace agreement which the American president is now also insisting on? Today, we'll break down the so-called dictator Putin's package, which in short requires Ukraine to completely give up Donbas to the Russians. In exchange for this, Moscow supposedly promises a pause in hostilities in southern Ukraine. Let's break everything down comprehensively. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is August 18th. Before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, write any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. No unnecessary talk, we go over the facts very briefly. So, what is the so-called Putin package in reality? What did Putin promise Trump? What did he impose on the American president as conditions for a peace agreement in Russia's war against Ukraine? And according to Reuters and the Financial Times, in Alaska there was a demand that Ukraine must completely withdraw from the Donetsk region. In return, a freeze of the rest of the front line and possibly attention, a softening of other territorial claims. Let's use the correct names for things. This is an attempt to formalize politically what the Russians failed to achieve by military means. The deal isn't about peace, it's just a pause before the next round. So that this construction of Putin looks, let's say, balanced. So that Putin and Trump have something to offer the Europeans, saying, look, Kyiv is making concessions, but Moscow is also making concessions, so that this construction looks balanced. Moscow, brings up some moments, but small ones, that are supposed to really look like concessions on its part. Putin now wants all of Donetsk, but suggests freezing the front line in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Then there are statements being thrown around that Putin is ready to soften other demands. And in all this noise, it's being presented as a compromise, like Russia is also making concessions. But strategists see it differently here. Giving up useless pockets, as they say, is not a concession, it's straightening out the front lines, and a freeze is just repairing the rear. Sky News accurately reports today that if the Kremlin controls Donbas, it will become a springboard for their next offensive. And this is not a metaphor, it's a map of warehouses and, for example, railway junctions. So in fact, Putin is saying that he's ready to freeze the front line in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions and not advance any further. Honestly, they couldn't have gone further, it just wasn't working. In Donetsk, they've fought against Ukrainian defensive fortifications for 11 years without breaking through. Now they're saying, let's put it in the deal that what we couldn't capture by military means, we'll just get through political means. And then there's the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, those small pieces of territory where the fighting is going on. Putin, well, we could basically give that up, but not completely, to establish some kind of buffer zone there. And this is also supposedly presented as a concession, but are there any real concessions in this? No. Why did this whole topic suddenly take off in the information space? Why, is it being discussed so actively right now? Because the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska didn't bring the main thing, a truce and a ceasefire. And now Western media are stating that there is no breakthrough, the deal hasn't been reached, and if there is no silence on the front, then an agreement without a ceasefire is just a cover for continuing the war by other means. That is, the war doesn't stop, it will just look different. Meanwhile, Trump, is sugarcoating this pill and says, get a make deal, make a deal, make a deal. He says, we're almost at an agreement, but this almost is always, It's like he's telling Putin, on their terms, on Russian terms, on your terms, we've almost reached it. And these conditions, according to sources, match the long-standing demands of the Kremlin, Ukraine's rejection of NATO and the de facto legalization of the seizure of Crimea and Donbas. And Time magazine today notes this position. Give up NATO and Crimea, give up Donbas, and you'll get peace. Call it whatever you want, that's what they call realism over there. Or as Trump says, the deal of the century, but in fact it's just an attempt to break Ukraine's strategy, Ukraine's defense, and to break the legal framework of peace. And now we'll break down the legal side. Europe officially states that only Ukraine can decide on its territory and borders can't be changed by force. We will strengthen sanctions until there is a just and lasting peace. This is not just support for Ukraine, it's also a warning to both Washington and Moscow that any attempt to legitimize a forceful seizure through a peace deal will meet European resistance. And another key point, as the Europeans say, is no restrictions on the Ukrainian army. Why is this important? Because at the same time, Moscow is pushing, as they say, for symmetrical guarantees. If Ukraine gets security guarantees, Russia should also receive something. Like Ukraine can keep its army, but in a reduced format, just a little. So in reality, all these limits on the personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine, on the number of weapons, tanks, artillery, missiles, and so on. But all of this is just creating opportunities for Russia's next attack. About guarantees, right now Trump's team is saying that Putin agreed to security guarantees for Ukraine in the NATO style, but without joining NATO. It sounds kind of good. There is a compromise. Ukraine isn't accepted into NATO. Trump talks about this a lot, but he says that instead we will provide security guarantees, almost like those of NATO, but without NATO. Yes, it appears to be a golden mean, but the details are crucial. Guarantees without the automatic initiation of military assistance, without ratification by the parliaments of all NATO members, without firm quotas for arms supplies. All of this, is the Budapest Memorandum number 2, and the Kremlin knows this very well. The Kremlin needs a piece of paper that sounds good but doesn't include anything automatic. That's why agreeing to these kinds of security guarantees is not a concession from Moscow. It's an attempt to sell air in exchange for Ukrainian territories. That is, if these security guarantees clearly stated that starting tomorrow and for the next 30 years, for example, Ukraine would receive a certain amount of weapons every year. The army is strengthened within certain limits. All parliaments ratify these security guarantees and commit to assisting with the military contingent of NATO countries in the event of new aggression, and so on and so forth. These are guarantees, but just writing that we guarantee to help if something happens is not a guarantee. It's just a fiction. What does Ukraine say? Zelensky says Ukrainians won't give land to occupiers or withdraw troops from Donbass, as that would break their defense. And that's final. For Ukraine, a freeze dictated by the Kremlin is not peace. Sorry, but that's just cutting off a piece of territory that the Russians couldn't capture. In this sense, any deal with minus Donbass will be perceived as a capitulation. Another factor will arise. Internal Ukrainian politics will make the question disappear. In general, any Ukrainian government that signs this minus Donbass agreement. The political psychology of the moment is as follows. Moscow needs a pause, Washington needs a result. Well, not Washington, Donald Trump needs a result. And Europe needs this result not to destroy the very idea of European security. Here comes the media scene with, as The Guardian writes today, Zelensky's bodyguards, Macron, Starmer, Merz, Meloni, Stubb, von der Leyen and Mark Rutte. And now The Guardian warns, Europe still doesn't have a coherent plan in case the United States wavers. That's why Europe is forced to be in the room and stick to the line of no territorial concessions, without any limitations. The armed forces of Ukraine, with increased sanctions, this isn't an anti-Trump front, it's fear of the domino effect. Today it's Donbass, next a new freeze. Then what? Why do we keep going and paying for someone else's war? And there's one more hidden point that people like to, leave unsaid. The Telegraph writes today that among the demands in this Putin package are the protection of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine and official status for the Russian language. And, as you understand, this isn't about humanism at all. It's not about protecting national minorities or about protecting religious groups. All of this is infrastructure for Russian influence inside Ukraine. Because the Russian language means schools, it means education, it means shaping the population, it means courts, it means power, it means the information space, and so on. This is Russian language seepage. And the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is a media agenda, it's an agent network, KGB agents, and so on and so on. That is, by including all these points about the Russian language and the Russian Orthodox Church in the peace agreement, the Kremlin gets legal levers of influence on Ukraine's internal politics, and after that everything is simple. Any violations of the rights of Russian speakers, the Russian Orthodox Church, and so on turn into a tool for blackmail. This isn't a guarantee of peace, conflict is built in. That's why, as long as the war continues along the front line, it's impossible to make any agreements, because Putin immediately embeds points of conflict there, so that later he can say, listen, Ukraine is not complying with the terms of the peace agreement. And here's a fair question. Where are the so-called concessions in all of this? They say that with Trump, Putin is also making concessions, but there aren't any. After all, the proposal to freeze the front under conditions favorable for the next strike and to consider some minor returns of territory that don't change the strategic picture, these aren't concessions at all. Russia is ready to discuss returning some small patches in exchange for all of Donetsk, meaning the Donetsk region. It's clever, yes, it doesn't bring peace also, yes, and this needs to be said out loud. Putin's package is not a compromise, it's an attempt to legally seal Ukraine's defeat. That's a quote from Reuters. And finally, if someone says that peace can be achieved pretty quickly, almost immediately you should ask them right away, will this peace last at least for a year? If the so-called guarantees are just words and not mechanisms, if the deal is simply the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine from Donbass, if sanctions are just a bargaining chip for a pretty picture, then none of this is peace. All of this is just a pause. And that pause will be paid for in blood in a year, maybe in half a year, maybe in 3 years. And here Reuters quotes Trump, "We almost reached an agreement. Ukraine must agree." Kyiv's response has already been voiced. We will not give up our land. We will not break our defense. Europe states that borders can't be changed by force, and that's our position. So, for now, it all looks like Trump is trying to impose a peace on Ukraine and Europe that will just look good on the surface, so that Trump can come out and declare, I have achieved peace. But in reality, it will just be a pause. So I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.